Trust is like a grand mansion, built over years with countless bricks of shared moments and whispered secrets. But its foundation is glass, and once shattered, you can spend a lifetime trying to sweep up the pieces, only to find you're still bleeding on the shards. For Amelia Sterling, that mansion wasn't just a metaphor. It was the sprawling penthouse on Park Avenue, with views that made the city lights look like a carpet of fallen stars. And on a Tuesday night, under the cold, relentless torrent of a New York storm, she discovered its foundation had been pulverized into dust. She had just returned from a 3-day trip to Boston, sitting by her mother's bedside as she recovered from pneumonia. The drive back was treacherous, the rain lashing against her windshield, but she was sustained by the thought of home, of kicking off her soaked shoes and sinking into the arms of her husband, Richard. But when the private elevator opened directly into their foyer, the first thing she saw was not his welcoming smile, but a stark white paper taped to the rich mahogany of their front door. It was a notice of foreclosure. Cold, legal text swam before her eyes, words like default and immediate seizure, seeming alien and absurd. Her key still worked, but it opened the door to a cavernous void. The apartment was hollowed out. The grand piano Richard had bought her for their first anniversary, gone. The collection of modern art they had curated together, gone. Even the custom-built bookshelves, now just pale outlines on the wall where they used to stand. It was a surgical removal of a life, executed with terrifying precision. A cold dread, far colder than the rain-soaked coat on her back, began to creep up her spine. This wasn't a robbery. Robbers were messy. This was a demolition. Her hands trembling, she pulled out her phone. The joint bank account, which should have held a 7-figure sum, stared back at her with a single, brutal number: 0. Her personal credit card app flashed a glaring red banner: account frozen. She tried to call Richard, her heart hammering against her ribs, a frantic, desperate rhythm, but there was no ringing. Just a sterile, automated voice informing her that the number was no longer in service. He was gone. They were all gone. The money, the art, the man she had built her world around. She was left with nothing but the clothes she was wearing, the hum of an empty refrigerator, and a betrayal so vast it had its own gravity, pulling her down until her knees hit the cold, unforgiving marble of the floor. And as she sat there, a ghost in the shell of her own life, the only sound was the rain outside, weeping for a woman who was too stunned to even cry. To understand how a life could be so completely dismantled, you must first understand how it was built. It wasn't a home built on the solid ground of mutual respect, but a stage set, exquisitely designed and lit to perfection. Before the cold marble floor and the hollowed-out rooms, there was a world of warmth, ambition, and what Amelia had fiercely, foolishly, believed was unshakable love. Their story, the one they sold to the world and the one she told herself every night, was a modern fairy tale set against the glittering backdrop of Manhattan's elite. Amelia herself was no damsel in distress waiting for a prince. She was a woman forged in intelligence and quiet determination. She had graduated summa cum laude from the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School, a place where ambition was the air you breathed. Her mind was a beautiful, ordered landscape of numbers and projections, market trends, and risk analysis. Wall Street firms had come calling before the ink on her diploma was dry, offering staggering salaries and corner offices in the sky. She had a clear path ahead, a future she had meticulously planned, one that would lead to a partnership and a name for herself in the cutthroat world of finance. But then she met Richard Sterling at a university fundraising gala. He wasn't just handsome, he was luminous. He possessed a charisma that filled any room he entered, a smile that seemed to disarm the most cynical of investors, and a vision that was as grand as it was intoxicating. He spoke of building an empire, not just a business, and when he looked at Amelia, he made her feel as though she was the only person in the world who could see the blueprints. He was captivated by her brilliance. In the beginning, he loved her mind, her quick wit, the way she could dissect a faulty business plan in minutes. He called her his secret weapon. And then, slowly, masterfully, he convinced her to lay down that weapon. "Ames," he would say, his voice a low, persuasive hum, "I'm the front man, the dreamer. But you're the architect of our life." "I can't build a legacy if I'm worried about which charity to support or what color to paint the dining room. I need you, not as an employee in some soulless firm, but as my partner, my anchor." He painted her sacrifice as a promotion. She wasn't giving up her career. She was ascending to a higher, more crucial role, the curator of their shared destiny. And Amelia, blinded by love and the seductive power of his dream, believed him. She traded stock portfolios for social calendars, hostile takeovers for catered dinners. She poured all of her formidable intelligence and energy into creating the perfect ecosystem in which his ambition could flourish. Their home became her project, their social standing, her full-time job. She was, by all accounts, the perfect corporate wife. And then there was Margaret Sterling, Richard's mother. Margaret was a woman carved from ice and old money. She moved through the world with the unshakable certainty of someone who had never been told no. From the moment Richard introduced Amelia, Margaret saw her not as a future daughter, but as a strategic miscalculation. Amelia's family was middle class, her bloodline unremarkable, her only assets a sharp mind and a quiet grace, currencies Margaret held in very low esteem. Her disapproval was never a dramatic confrontation, but a slow-acting poison administered in tiny, almost imperceptible doses. At lavish family dinners, she would praise Amelia's dress by noting how well she was learning to adapt to their world. She would bring up Richard's ex-girlfriends, women from powerful families, lamenting how advantageous those matches might have been. To Amelia's face, she was all chilly politeness. But in the quiet moments with her son, she planted seeds of doubt. "She's a sweet girl, Richard," she would sigh, adjusting the pearls at her throat. "But is she a statement? A man in your position needs a wife who is an asset, not just an accompaniment." She painted Amelia's steady, supportive nature as a lack of drive, her contentment as a sign that she would hold him back, tethering his soaring ambition to the mundane ground of domesticity. Richard, for all his outward confidence, was still a boy seeking his mother's approval. He would defend Amelia, at first, but Margaret's words were like water on stone, a constant, gentle drip that eventually wears away even the strongest resolve. He began to see Amelia through his mother's eyes. Her thoughtful questions about his business deals became nagging. Her desire for a quiet evening at home became a lack of social stamina. The very foundation he had claimed to need was beginning to feel like a cage. Their life became a performance. They were the golden couple at every gala, every fundraiser, every exclusive opening. Richard, expansive and charming. Amelia, elegant and serene by his side. They were a brand, an image of perfect partnership. But backstage, the illusion was fraying. He would come home late, smelling of expensive perfume that wasn't hers, and dismiss her concerns with a wave of his hand. "Networking, Ames. It's all networking. You wouldn't understand." The phrase became his shield and his sword, simultaneously excusing his behavior and reminding her of the world she had given up, a world he now claimed she could no longer comprehend. Amelia felt the shift. It was a subtle change in the atmosphere, the growing silence in the car rides home, the way his eyes would look past her, as if focusing on a future she was no longer a part of. But she pushed the feeling down. To acknowledge it would be to admit that her sacrifice had been for nothing, that the entire edifice of their life was a lie. She had invested everything she was into this man, into this life, and she couldn't bear the thought of foreclosure. So she played her part with even more dedication, hosted more elegant parties, smiled more brightly, and ignored the spreading cracks in the glass foundation, praying that if she didn't look at them, they might somehow cease to exist. She was the loyal, loving wife, standing steadfast in a mansion she didn't realize was already condemned. The decay of a marriage, much like the decay of a great house, does not begin with a collapse. It begins with a loosening board, a faint scent of damp in a forgotten corner, a hairline crack in the plaster. These are the small, easily ignored warnings that precede the devastating ruin. For Amelia, the first cracks in her gilded life appeared not as fissures, but as subtle shifts in atmosphere, tiny anomalies in the perfect orbit of the world she shared with Richard. The first was his phone, an object that had once been a shared piece of their life, left casually on the nightstand or the kitchen counter, became a guarded secret. It was now perpetually screened down, and a sudden buzz would cause him to silence it with a swift, almost reflexive motion. He began taking calls on the terrace, even on the coldest of evenings, his voice a low murmur carried away by the wind. His back turned to the glass doors, a literal and symbolic turning away from her. Then came the business trips. They grew more frequent, more urgent, and always more vague. A last-minute flight to Chicago to court a potential investor. A weekend in Miami to scout a new property. He would return not with the weariness of a man who had spent 48 hours in boardrooms, but with the vibrant energy of a man on vacation, a faint tan on his skin in the middle of winter. The details of his stories were always impeccable, yet they felt hollow, rehearsed. Once, while unpacking his suitcase, Amelia found a receipt from a high-end jewelry store, dated the day before. When she asked about it, he didn't miss a beat. "Ah, that," he said with an easy smile. "A little something for Mrs. Davenport. Her husband is our lead investor. You know how it is, Ames. You have to keep everyone happy." He said it with such casual confidence that to question it further would have seemed petty, even shrewish. She was, after all, the woman who had left that world behind, and he never missed an opportunity to gently remind her of it. The real tremor, the one that sent a deep, unsettling vibration through the foundation of her trust, was a financial one. While paying their monthly bills online, a task she still managed with the meticulousness of her former profession, she noticed a significant wire transfer. A sum of $250,000 had been moved from their joint savings account to a limited liability company she had never heard of, Apex Horizon Holdings. When she approached Richard, she did so not with accusation, but with a genuine, wifely concern. "Richard, honey," she began, holding her laptop, "I saw this transfer. I don't recognize the company name. Is everything all right?" He looked up from his newspaper, his expression one of mild annoyance, as if she were a child who had wandered into his office. Then, his face softened into a look of patient condescension. "It's a holding company, Ames. A strategic maneuver. We're moving into a new development phase, and my lawyers advise me to shield some of our liquid assets. It's just smart business. It's for us." He used financial jargon like a smokescreen, terms she understood perfectly but that, in his mouth, served to build a wall between them. He made her feel as if she were questioning his competence, his ability to provide, his very role as the man of the house. "You have to trust me on this," he finished, his tone leaving no room for discussion. A few weeks later, he came to her with the instrument of her own destruction. He was in a hurry, dressed for a flight, the scent of his expensive cologne filling their bedroom. In his hand was a thick, leather-bound folio filled with documents. "Ames, sweetheart, I need a huge favor," he said. His voice rushed but smooth. "These are just the final incorporation papers for the new venture. My lawyers messed up and need your signature as a board partner before I leave. It's just a formality." He spread the documents across her vanity table, the pages filled with dense, legal text. He handed her a pen, already uncapped, and pointed to the yellow tabs marking the signature lines. "Here, here, and here." The old Amelia, the Wharton prodigy, screamed in her mind, "Read it. Read every word. This is how people get ruined." But the current Amelia, the wife who had built her identity on trust and support, saw only the impatience in his eyes, the tapping of his fingers on the mahogany. To pause, to read, to question it would be a declaration of war. It would be the final admission that she no longer trusted him. He must have sensed her hesitation, the slight tightening of her hand. He leaned down and kissed her forehead. "It's all for us, remember," he whispered. "The empire." That small gesture of affection, that poisoned reminder of their shared dream, was all it took. She picked up the pen. Her signature, once a symbol of her sharp, analytical mind, flowed across the pages, an elegant script of surrender. She was signing away her life, and she did it with a loving smile. The confirmation of her folly came on a quiet Thursday afternoon. She was arranging flowers in the living room, a task of domestic artistry she had come to enjoy. She thought Richard was at his downtown office. The landline in the study, a phone they rarely used, began to ring. Out of habit, she walked in to answer it, but stopped when she heard Richard's voice. He must have picked up the extension in their bedroom. He was speaking in a low, conspiratorial tone, and Amelia instinctively froze, her hand hovering over the receiver. The voice that answered him was crisp, cold, and instantly recognizable. It was his mother, Margaret. "Is it done?" Margaret asked, her voice devoid of any warmth. "It is," Richard replied, a note of triumph in his voice. "She signed everything this morning. Didn't even read a single page." It was almost too easy. Amelia felt the blood drain from her face. She leaned closer, her breath caught in her throat. "Good," Margaret's voice was like chipping ice. "The properties are already secured in the family trust. The liquid assets will be cleared by tomorrow. It's time to finalize the plan, Richard. It is time to divest from the redundant asset. I'll handle it as soon as I get back from the city," he said. "She won't see it coming." Redundant asset. The words echoed in the silent study, hitting Amelia with the force of a physical blow. An asset. Something to be used, valued for its utility, and then discarded, liquidated, when it was no longer needed. They weren't talking about stocks or properties. They were talking about her. She gently, silently, placed the receiver back in its cradle, her hand shaking so badly she could barely control it. Her entire marriage, her entire life, had been a business transaction, and she was the bad investment they were about to write off. The crack was no longer a crack. It was a gaping chasm, and she had just realized she'd been standing on the wrong side of it all along. The silence that followed the overheard phone call was a living entity. It filled the vast, opulent spaces of the penthouse, smothering all other sounds. For 3 days, Amelia moved through her home like a phantom, her feet making no noise on the plush carpets. She mechanically watered the orchids. She straightened the already perfect cushions on the sofa. She stared at the city lights that no longer looked like jewels, but like the cold, indifferent eyes of a million strangers. Richard was still on his business trip, and his absence, once a small ache of loneliness, was now a terrifying void. She was living inside a beautifully furnished tomb, waiting for the door to be sealed. Every buzz of her phone made her flinch. Every chime of the elevator in the hall sent a jolt of ice through her veins. She knew the storm was coming. She just didn't know how utterly devastating the first strike would be. It came not as a dramatic confrontation, but as a cool, dispassionate voice on the other end of the phone. "Is this Amelia Sterling?" the voice asked, smooth and devoid of emotion. "My name is Marcus Thorne. I am legal counsel for Mr. Richard Sterling. I'm calling to inform you that a petition for the dissolution of your marriage was filed this morning in the family court of Clark County, Nevada." Nevada. The word hung in the air. Amelia knew what it meant. A state known for its quick, no-fuss divorces, a place where one party could establish residency in a matter of weeks and push through a settlement before the other party even had time to mount a defense. It was the chosen jurisdiction of the strategic and the ruthless. "You will be served with the official papers within the next 24 hours, the voice continued, as calmly as if he were confirming a dinner reservation. "Mr. Sterling wishes for this process to be as efficient as possible." Then he hung up. Efficient. That was the word he used. A 10-year marriage, a life built together, was to be dismantled with efficiency. Stunned, Amelia contacted an old family friend who practiced corporate law, a kind, semi-retired man named Arthur. She explained the situation, her voice trembling as she recounted the wire transfers, the signed documents, the overheard conversation. Arthur listened patiently, his silence a comforting presence. He promised to make some inquiries. The information he came back with, delivered over 2 days in a series of grim phone calls, was the blueprint of her annihilation. The documents she had signed were not mere formalities. They were a masterfully crafted legal trap. One was a power of attorney, giving Richard complete control over her financial affairs. Another was a post-nuptial agreement, written in dense legalese, in which she unknowingly waived her rights to any and all assets acquired during the marriage, both known and unknown. The final set of papers, the thickest stack, was a series of personal guarantees. She had, with her own elegant signature, personally secured hundreds of thousands of dollars in high-interest business loans. Loans taken out by Richard in the preceding months, the funds from which had been funneled directly into the Apex Horizon Holdings account. And Apex Horizon Holdings, Arthur discovered, was just the tip of the iceberg. It was one of a dozen shell companies, all registered in Delaware, all listing one person as the sole director, Margaret Sterling. The penthouse they lived in, which Amelia believed was in both their names, had been transferred to a trust controlled by Margaret 6 months ago. The cars, the art collection, even Richard's sizable stock portfolio, all had been systematically siphoned off, legally insulated from her reach. He had meticulously stripped every asset from the marital column and placed it under his mother's impenetrable corporate shield. But the debt, Arthur explained with a heavy sigh, the debt was all hers. The documents she signed made her the sole guarantor. Richard had used her name, her sterling reputation, and her past financial credentials to secure the loans, and then legally absolved himself of any responsibility. She wasn't just being left with nothing. She was being left with a crushing, insurmountable debt, a financial crater from which she could never hope to escape. As Amelia sat numbly trying to process the sheer, diabolical brilliance of the scheme, the final blow was struck. It came from a place she least expected it, the glittering, superficial world of social media she had so carefully curated for them. A text message from a so-called friend, a woman from her charity circle. "Oh, Amelia, darling, I am so sorry. Thinking of you," the text read, dripping with false sympathy. Below it was a link to an Instagram profile. The name on the profile was Isabella Vance. The face was that of a stunningly beautiful woman in her early 20s. And the feed was a public declaration of Amelia's humiliation. The most recent post, from just hours earlier, was a picture of Isabella and Richard on the deck of a magnificent yacht, the turquoise waters of the Caribbean sparkling behind them. He was laughing, his arm wrapped tightly around her bare waist. The caption read, "Finally free to live our truth. Here's to the future with my soulmate and the king of my world. I love you, R.S." She scrolled down, her thumb moving with a morbid, unstoppable curiosity. It was all there, a meticulously documented timeline of his betrayal. Richard and Isabella in Paris, kissing in front of the Eiffel Tower, the photo dated during his investor summit in Germany. Richard and Isabella on a ski trip in Aspen, when he was supposedly in a conference in Denver. There were photos of them at exclusive restaurants, at red carpet events, wearing designer clothes. And then, the picture that shattered the last remaining fragment of Amelia's heart, a photo of Isabella wearing a magnificent diamond necklace, a piece Amelia recognized instantly. It was a family heirloom, a gift from her own grandmother, which she had kept in their safe. The caption, posted by Isabella, read, "My baby knows how to spoil me." A little vintage piece to celebrate our new beginning. He hadn't just stolen her money and her future. He had stolen her past, too, and gifted it to his new lover. The divorce papers arrived that afternoon. The foreclosure notice was posted on her door the next morning. It was a perfect storm, a coordinated assault of legal, financial, and emotional warfare, designed not just to end a marriage, but to erase a person from existence. And as she stood in the echoing silence of her empty home, the triumphant, smiling face of her husband's mistress burned into her memory, Amelia understood. This was never a partnership. It was a long, patient, and devastatingly successful heist. And she was the prize. The fall from grace is never a gentle slope. It is a sudden, brutal cliff edge. And for Amelia, the plunge was dizzying. One moment she was the mistress of a Park Avenue palace. The next she was standing on the rain-slicked pavement, a single suitcase in her hand, the doorman of her own building refusing to meet her eyes. The world she had known, a world of soft fabrics, polite applause, and the subtle scent of expensive lilies, had vanished. In its place was a new reality, one that was coarse, loud, and smelled of desperation. Her free fall ended in a part of the city she had only ever driven through with the windows up, in a place called the Haven Hotel, a name that was a cruel joke. It was a single-room occupancy building, a place for people with no other place to go. Her new home was a small, square room with a stained mattress, a single flickering bulb, and a window that looked out onto a brick wall. The thin walls vibrated with the arguments of her neighbors, the air thick with the ghosts of stale cigarette smoke and cheap whiskey. This was rock bottom, and it was a loud, lonely, and terrifying place. Her days, once filled with charity luncheons and art gallery openings, were now a grueling cycle of survival. She learned the unique humiliation of menial labor, not because the work itself was shameful, but because of the stark contrast to the life that had been stolen from her. She found a job washing dishes in the back of a greasy spoon diner, her hands, once soft and manicured, becoming red and raw from the scalding water and harsh soap. The clatter of plates and the constant shouting of orders was a deafening soundtrack to her fall. She, who had debated financial strategy with CEOs, now scraped dried egg yolk off plates for minimum wage. After her shift at the diner, she would take the subway to a downtown office building where she was part of a late-night cleaning crew. She would scrub toilets and polish floors in buildings where, just a year earlier, she had attended lavish corporate parties. She became a ghost, invisible to the world. She would see women in expensive coats, women who looked like her former friends, like her former self, and they would look straight through her, an anonymous figure in a gray janitor's uniform. That social death was, in some ways, more painful than the financial one. In the first few weeks, she had tried to call the people she thought were her friends. The calls were met with a series of polite but firm rejections. Voices that had once dripped with warmth and affection became strained and distant. "Oh, Amelia, I heard what happened. It's just dreadful," they would say. "But you understand, it's a very awkward position for us, with Richard." The sentence always trailed off, but the meaning was clear. They were siding with the winner. She was a scandal, a failure, a social liability. The final brutal confirmation came one afternoon when she was walking to the subway. Across the street, she saw Caroline, the woman who had been her maid of honor, the godmother to a child they never had. Their eyes met for a fleeting second. Amelia saw a flash of recognition, of shock, and then of pure panic. Caroline immediately looked away, pulling her phone from her purse and quickening her pace, disappearing into the crowd. She had been seen, and then deliberately, cruelly, unseen. In that moment, Amelia understood that she hadn't just lost her husband, she had lost her entire tribe. The nights were the worst. The physical exhaustion of her jobs did little to quiet the torture of her mind. In the darkness of her small, grim room, the images would play on a relentless loop. Richard laughing on the yacht, Isabella wearing her grandmother's necklace, the cold, clinical text of the foreclosure notice. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. The calls from debt collectors started, their voices ranging from falsely sympathetic to openly hostile, reminding her of the mountain of debt that bore her name. There were moments, dark and terrifying, when the thought of surrender was a sweet relief. She would stand on the edge of the subway platform and feel the rush of wind from an approaching train, imagining a single, simple step. She would look at the bottle of sleeping pills she had bought, thinking how easy it would be to just make the noise stop, to finally sleep without the nightmares. The despair was an ocean, and she was drowning. It was during one such night, sitting on the edge of her lumpy mattress, the city's mournful sirens wailing in the distance, that she hit the absolute floor of her soul. She had nothing left. No money, no friends, no hope. She opened her lone suitcase, the last remnant of her former life, to pull out a sweater. And there, tucked in a side pocket, was the one thing she had grabbed without thinking, an object of pure sentiment. It was her grandmother's recipe book. It was a small, leather-bound journal, its cover softened with age, its pages stained with vanilla and butter from decades of use. She ran her fingers over the faded, spidery handwriting, and a memory, so powerful it was almost a hallucination, flooded her senses. The scent of cinnamon, yeast, and melting sugar. The warmth of her grandmother's kitchen, the sound of her gentle humming. It was a memory of a love that was real, unconditional, and freely given. It was the absolute antithesis of the life she had lived with Richard. A strange, forgotten impulse stirred within her. She took the last $20 she had in the world and went to a small, all-night grocery store. She didn't buy a pre-made meal or something to numb the pain. She bought flour, sugar, butter, yeast, and cinnamon. Back in her room, using the tiny, unreliable hot plate and a small toaster oven, she began to bake. She followed her grandmother's instructions for cinnamon rolls, her hands moving with a forgotten muscle memory. The act of measuring, of mixing, of kneading the dough was a meditation. It was creation. It was order in the midst of chaos. As the rolls baked, a warm, sweet aroma began to fill the small, sad room, an impossible fragrance of hope and home that momentarily overpowered the smell of decay. When they were done, she sat on her bed and took a bite. The warmth and sweetness exploded in her mouth, and it was then that she finally broke. The tears came, a hot, cleansing flood. But these were not the tears of a victim. They were the tears of rage, of grief, and of a dawning, terrible resolve. The pain hadn't killed her. It had burned away everything that was false, everything that was weak. What was left was something hard, pure, and unbreakable. Her suffering had not been an ending. It had been a forge. And as she looked at the worn recipe book, a new light in her eyes, she knew that the long, dark night of her soul was not over. But for the first time, she could see the dawn. The redundant asset was about to discover her own value. The cinnamon roll was not a meal. It was a manifesto. It was a declaration that even in the deepest, darkest pit of despair, the act of creation was still possible. That single taste of warmth and sweetness did not erase the bitterness of Amelia's reality, but it gave her a direction. Survival was no longer the goal. The goal was to build. Armed with her grandmother's recipe book, a testament to a love that was given, not transacted, she began the slow, arduous work of laying a new cornerstone for her life. The foundation would not be glass this time. It would be forged from flour, water, and fire. Her new enterprise was born in the pre-dawn hours in the cramped, grim kitchen of her SRO hotel room. The proceeds from her grueling janitorial job were now funneled into a different kind of investment: bulk bags of flour, yeast, and butter, purchased from a discount wholesaler. Sleep became a luxury she could not afford. Her nights were spent in a hypnotic rhythm of mixing, kneading, and shaping dough under the unforgiving glare of a single bare bulb. Her tiny toaster oven could only handle one small loaf, 1/2 dozen muffins at a time. It was an absurdly inefficient, almost hopeless operation. But with each perfectly baked item that emerged, she felt a flicker of defiance. Richard and Margaret had liquidated her assets. They could not liquidate her spirit. Her first foray into this new world was at a farmer's market in a scruffy, unpretentious neighborhood far from the polished streets she once knew. She set up a rickety card table, covered it with a clean, threadbare tablecloth, and arranged her meager offerings: a few loaves of rustic sourdough, some glistening morning buns, and a small platter of dark chocolate sea salt cookies. Her sign was a piece of cardboard with Grandma's hearth written in careful, slightly shaky script. Every person who walked by sent a wave of terror through her. She felt exposed, her heart and soul laid bare on that wobbly table. These were not just baked goods, they were the tangible proof of her last-ditch effort to exist. But then, a strange thing happened. People stopped. A construction worker on his way to a job site bought a bun, took a bite, and his gruff face softened. A young mother pushing a stroller bought a cookie for her child, and then another for herself, her eyes closing in a moment of pure bliss. They didn't know her story. They knew nothing of penthouses or betrayal. They only knew what they tasted. And what they tasted was real. This wasn't the mass-produced, chemically perfected pastry of a commercial bakery. It was something made with time, with patience, and with a depth of feeling that was unintentionally baked into every crumb. Her pain, her loss, her desperate need to create something beautiful in the face of so much ugliness, it was all there. An invisible ingredient that made her bread taste like comfort, and her cookies taste like a memory of home. Slowly, week by week, her reputation grew. She became the bread lady, a familiar fixture at the market. Regulars would line up before she had even finished setting up. She learned their names, their orders, the little details of their lives. For the first time since her fall, she felt a sense of community. It wasn't the transactional, air-kissing community of the social elite, but a genuine connection forged over a shared appreciation for a well-made loaf of bread. She saved every dollar, living on unsold bread and weak tea. The debt loomed, a dark mountain on the horizon, but she now had a small, sturdy pickaxe, and she was chipping away at its base, one cookie at a time. The turning point arrived on a miserable, rainy Saturday. The wind whipped through the market, threatening to tear her small tent from its moorings. Customers were scarce. Amelia was cold, soaked, and on the verge of despair, worried she wouldn't even make back the cost of her ingredients. Through the sheets of rain, an older man approached her stall. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored wool coat, holding a large black umbrella. He had a kind face, etched with the lines of a long and thoughtful life. He didn't speak at first, simply observing her display with intelligent, discerning eyes. Then he looked at her, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. She felt seen. He didn't see a pathetic, rain-soaked woman. He saw the quality of her work, the pride in her exhausted eyes. "Sourdough," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "1 loaf, please." He paid with a crisp bill, and, to her surprise, he broke off a piece of the crust right there, under the shelter of his umbrella. He chewed it slowly, thoughtfully. A faint, appreciative smile touched his lips. "This has character," he said simply, then nodded and walked away. He returned the next week, and the week after that. He introduced himself as Wei Chen. He began to engage her in conversation, asking about her fermentation times, the source of her flour, the way she achieved such a perfect crust. He spoke to her as an equal, a fellow artisan. One day, after buying his usual loaf, he hesitated. "My name is Wei Chen," he said again, as if reintroducing himself. "I own a small cafe, a few streets from here. It is called the Gilded Bean. I came to this country 40 years ago with nothing. I washed dishes, I worked hard, and I built my business from the floor up. I know what it is to create something from nothing." He looked at her small, windswept stall. "Your product is magnificent. Your brand is your heart. But your kitchen," he said with a gentle, knowing smile, "I suspect your kitchen is not worthy of your talent." He then made her an offer that changed everything. "My cafe kitchen is large, professional, and it sits empty every night from midnight until the morning shift arrives at 6. I propose a partnership. You may use my kitchen, my ovens, my space. In return, you will become the sole supplier of bread and pastries for the Gilded Bean. No rent, just a simple supply contract. We will see how my customers respond. And if they love your work as I do, we will talk about the future." Amelia was speechless. The kindness, the trust from this stranger was so overwhelming, it almost brought her to tears. A part of her, the wounded, scarred part, was suspicious. Why would anyone help her? What was the catch? Mr. Chen seemed to understand. The next week, he brought her a 1-page contract, simple, clear, and fair. "In my experience," he said, his eyes twinkling, "it is always wise to read the fine print and to trust the person who encourages you to do so." That single piece of advice, that acknowledgement of her intelligence and respect for her caution, shattered her remaining defenses. This was not a predator. This was an ally. With a hand that was now steady and sure, she signed her name. Her first night in the kitchen of the Gilded Bean was a revelation. The gleaming stainless steel counters, the cavernous convection ovens, the sheer space to work, it was a world away from the corner of her dingy room. She felt a profound sense of coming home, not to a place of opulence, but to a place of potential. As she slid the first dozen loaves of sourdough into the roaring heat of the commercial oven, she watched through the small glass window as they rose, the heat transforming the simple dough into something golden, nourishing, and beautiful. The phoenix's ember, so carefully nurtured in the dark, was now in the heart of the furnace. It was ready to become a fire. The partnership with Mr. Chen was not just a lifeline, it was a crucible. In the gleaming, professional kitchen of the Gilded Bean, working through the quiet, lonely hours between midnight and dawn, Amelia was reborn. Her baked goods, now produced with consistency and scale, became the talk of the neighborhood. Customers would come for Mr. Chen's perfect coffee and find themselves staying for Amelia's transcendent sourdough, her flaky croissants that tasted of Paris, her cinnamon rolls that felt like a warm embrace. The small corner of the cafe dedicated to her products, which they branded Amelia's Hearth, soon had a line of its own, stretching out onto the sidewalk each morning. The success was immediate, tangible, and for Amelia, it was the first taste of real power, a power that came not from a man's name or a joint bank account, but from the skill of her own two hands and the resilience of her spirit. The years that followed were a blur of relentless work, a montage scored to the rhythm of a whisk and the roar of an oven. The single counter at the Gilded Bean became a wholesale business, with high-end restaurants and boutique hotels clamoring to feature Amelia's Hearth on their menus. After 2 years of saving every penny, of living in a small, clean apartment above a flower shop, she and Mr. Chen, now her business partner and trusted friend, opened the first standalone Amelia's Hearth. It was not on Park Avenue. It was on a tree-lined street in a bustling, vibrant neighborhood, a place of community and warmth. The design was a reflection of her new self. Simple, elegant, and built with honest materials, reclaimed wood, warm lighting, and the intoxicating aroma of fresh bread. It was an instant success. A second location followed a year later, then a third. Within 5 years, Amelia's Hearth was a celebrated local chain, a small, fiercely loved empire built on quality, authenticity, and the quiet, unyielding determination of its founder. This external growth was mirrored by an even more profound internal transformation. The soft, trusting, domestic woman who had been Richard Sterling's wife was gone, burned away in the forge of her suffering. In her place stood a CEO. The brilliant mind that had graduated from Wharton, the mind she had willingly put to sleep for a decade, reawakened with a ferocious appetite. She wasn't just a baker anymore. She was a strategist, a logistician, a master of supply chains and profit margins. But she knew that to truly secure her future, and to reckon with her past, business acumen was not enough. She needed to understand the weapons that had been used against her. So, after her 14-hour days at the bakery, Amelia went to war. She enrolled in online law courses, her small apartment lit by the glow of a laptop screen late into the night. She didn't pursue a full degree, but instead launched a targeted, surgical strike on the subjects that mattered. She devoured textbooks on contract law, dissecting the language of deception, learning the loopholes and the liabilities. She became an expert in corporate finance, studying the structures of shell companies and offshore trusts, the very mechanisms Margaret had used to hide their stolen assets. She mastered real estate law, understanding the intricate dance of deeds, titles, and foreclosures. It was a grim, exacting education. Each legal precedent she studied, each contractual clause she memorized, was like examining a piece of the bomb that had detonated her life. But this time, she was learning how to defuse it, and more importantly, how to build one of her own. Her demeanor shifted. The haunted, fragile look in her eyes was replaced by a calm, unnerving focus. The woman who had once been gaslit into silence now negotiated with ruthless landlords and cutthroat suppliers, her voice never rising above a steady, measured tone, yet her will was absolute. She was fair, but she was firm. She was kind to her employees, but she demanded excellence. She was no longer the redundant asset. She was the entire damn corporation. And she was quietly, methodically, becoming incredibly wealthy. She continued to live modestly, her only indulgence being fresh flowers for her apartment and first-class ingredients for her bakeries. Every spare dollar of profit was not spent, but invested, guided by Mr. Chen's wisdom and her own rediscovered financial genius. She built a massive, diversified portfolio. It was a quiet fortune, held in stocks, municipal bonds, and commercial real estate, a silent, growing testament to her new life, completely invisible to the outside world. Throughout all these years of building and becoming, she never forgot. The memory of Richard's betrayal was not a source of pain anymore. It was a source of fuel, a cold, clean-burning energy that drove her forward. It was the whetstone against which she sharpened her mind. And she watched him. It was not a passionate, emotional obsession, but a cold, clinical observation, like a scientist studying a particularly venomous specimen. Through a discreet private investigator and public records, she tracked his ascent. Richard, ever the charismatic salesman, had landed on his feet. He was now the senior vice president of development at Walker Corporation, a massive, publicly traded real estate giant. He and Isabella were darlings of the society pages, their flawlessly curated life splashed across glossy magazines. There they were, smiling at a charity ball, cutting the ribbon on a new luxury condominium, vacationing in street Barts. They lived in a sprawling penthouse even grander than the one he had shared with Amelia, a monument to their unpunished avarice. They were the very picture of success, a success built on a foundation of lies, a foundation she now knew how to shatter. One evening, Amelia sat in the quiet of her simple, elegant office above her flagship store. The air smelled of cooling bread and victory. On her computer screen, she had two windows open. On the left was the real-time financial dashboard of her company, Amelia's Hearth, its revenue streams and profit margins glowing in a healthy, vibrant green. On the right was the stock profile for Walker Corporation. Its stock was stable, its outlook positive, and below the ticker symbol was a photograph of its senior leadership team. There, in the front row, was Richard, his smile as brilliant and empty as ever. The baker had built her hearth. The student had mastered the law. The victim had become a titan. And now, the financier was ready to make her first move. The long, patient game was about to begin. Vengeance, Amelia learned, is a dish best served cold. But a baker knows a different truth. Vengeance is a sourdough starter, a living thing that must be fed and nurtured in darkness. It requires patience, precision, and an intimate understanding of the transformative power of time. For years, Amelia had fed her starter with knowledge, with wealth, with an unwavering, icy resolve. She had watched it bubble and grow, gaining strength and complexity. Now, the time for fermentation was over. It was time to shape the dough. The campaign began not in a war room, but in the quiet, jasmine-scented office above her flagship bakery. Across from her sat Mr. Chen, his calm, steady presence a counterpoint to the audacity of her plan. On the table between them was not a recipe, but a detailed prospectus for Walker Corporation. She laid out her strategy with the passionless clarity of a seasoned fund manager. She spoke not of revenge or justice, but of a hostile takeover. She pointed out the company's vulnerabilities, its over-leveraged real estate portfolio, its complacent board of directors, its arrogant leadership, and a stock price that, in her expert opinion, was undervalued. Richard's name was never mentioned. He was not the target. He was simply a feature of the landscape she intended to conquer. Mr. Chen listened, his fingertips steepled, his eyes never leaving hers. He was not just her mentor, he was her consigliere, the keeper of her secrets. He asked the hard questions, probing for any weakness in her logic, any hint of emotional folly. "This will take years, Amelia," he said, his voice soft, "and it will consume a fortune. Are you prepared for that?" Amelia simply slid a file across the table. It was a detailed summary of her personal net worth, a number so staggering it made even Mr. Chen raise his eyebrows. "I am prepared," she said, her voice even. "I will use the tools of their world to dismantle it." Seeing the unshakable steel in her eyes, Mr. Chen gave a slow, deliberate nod. He then picked up his phone and made a call to a very old, very discreet law firm in Geneva. The war had begun. Her first move was to become a ghost. With the help of Mr. Chen's international network, she began to construct a labyrinthine corporate structure designed to be untraceable. This was where her late-night legal studies paid their first dividend. She established a series of anonymous LLCs, naming them with a blandness that defied suspicion. Midwest AgriFund, Sierra Asset Management, Keystone Industrial Trust. They were registered in Delaware, Nevada, and Wyoming states, known for their stringent corporate privacy laws. These entities were, in turn, owned by a trust in Switzerland, whose beneficiary was a foundation registered in the Cayman Islands. It was a complex, multi-layered web of legal entities, each one a cutout, a dead end. Amelia Sterling, the beloved local baker, had no legal connection to any of it. She had erased herself from the paper trail, just as Richard had once erased her from their life. Then, the silent accumulation began. Through her ghost companies, she started buying shares of Walker Corporation. The process was painstakingly slow, a masterpiece of financial stealth. Each LLC used a different brokerage house. The purchases were made in small, random blocks, never enough to trigger the 5% SEC disclosure threshold for any single entity. Some days they would buy, some days they would sell a few shares just to muddy the waters. The market saw only a slight uptick in trading volume, a healthy investor interest that the board and Richard smugly attributed to their own brilliant leadership. They were watching the ripples on the surface, completely oblivious to the Leviathan moving silently in the depths. Month after month, Amelia continued to run her bakeries by day, a picture of wholesome, entrepreneurial success. By night, she was a predator. Her laptop screen, a sea of stock tickers and encrypted messages, her ownership stake growing by fractions of a percent, 10%, 25%, 40%. She was becoming the company's largest and most invisible shareholder. But owning the company from the inside was not enough. She wanted to own it from the outside, too. She wanted to control its destiny, to hold the power of life and death over it. So she targeted its debt. Walker Corporation, like most large developers, was built on a mountain of borrowed money. They had corporate bonds, lines of credit, and massive commercial mortgages on their flagship properties. Amelia's research uncovered that one of their largest creditors, a mid-sized regional bank, was looking to de-risk its portfolio and offload some of its commercial real estate loans. Through another ghost company, Iron Gate Financial, she made them an offer. She bought Walker Corporation's debt, all of it, for 90 cents on the dollar. It was a brilliant move. The bank was happy to secure a small profit and remove the risk, and Amelia, overnight, became Walker Corporation's primary creditor. They now owed her millions of dollars in monthly payments. The fox was not just inside the henhouse, she now owned the mortgage on the farm. Meanwhile, Richard Sterling was living the life of a king. He was the golden boy of the New York real estate scene. He gave keynote speeches at industry conferences. His handsome face graced the covers of trade magazines. We see him in a glass-walled boardroom, 20 floors above the city, giving a triumphant presentation to the Walker Corp board. He speaks of record profits, of ambitious expansion plans, of a new mega-project that will reshape the city's skyline. The fundamentals have never been stronger, he declared, his voice booming with unearned confidence. He had no idea that the company's financial fundamentals were now fundamentally owned by the woman whose life he had treated as a disposable line item. He felt the ground beneath him was solid rock, when in reality it was a meticulously constructed trapdoor, and a hand he had long forgotten was resting on the lever. The silent gambit, the patient work of 2 long years, culminated on a quiet Tuesday evening. Amelia sat in her office, the soft glow of her monitor reflecting in her calm, focused eyes. An encrypted email arrived from her lawyers in Geneva. Attached was a single document. It was a certified holdings report detailing the ownership stakes of all her various entities. She scrolled to the bottom line. The network of ghost companies she commanded now collectively owned 52% of the voting shares of Walker Corporation. It was done. She was the majority owner. The invisible hand that had been guiding the market was now revealed to be hers. The woman who had been left with nothing now owned everything. The trap was set. The noose was placed. All that was left was to call the meeting and introduce the new management. Power, once acquired, is a silent instrument. In the wrong hands, it is a bludgeon. In the right hands, it is a scalpel, capable of excising a sickness with microsurgical precision. For Amelia, the 52% controlling stake in Walker Corporation was not a prize to be flaunted, but a complex tool she was now ready to wield. Her first act as the Shadow Empress of Richard's world was not a dramatic firing or a public exposé. It was a quiet, brutally efficient legal maneuver, executed through her lawyers in Geneva. A notice was filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission, calling for an emergency shareholder vote. The agenda was simple: the immediate dissolution of the current board of directors, and the appointment of a new interim board. The vote was a formality, a corporate execution conducted by proxy. The old guard board members, the silver-haired men who had golfed with Richard's father and enabled his ascent, were wiped out in a single electronic resolution. In their place, a slate of new names was installed. They were highly respected, but intentionally obscure professionals. A retired judge from Delaware, a finance professor from Chicago, a logistical savant from Singapore, all of them unknowingly on Amelia's payroll, their actions guided by a single, anonymous client. The coup was swift, bloodless, and utterly terrifying to the executive ranks of Walker Corporation. The company had been hijacked, and no one knew who was flying the plane. Richard experienced the fallout as a series of bewildering tremors. First came the hushed, panicked whispers in the hallways. Then the official, sterile memo announcing the sudden retirement of the CEO, a man who had been his mentor and champion. The news sent a shockwave through the company. Then, other senior executives, his allies, were summarily dismissed, their access cards deactivated, their corner offices sealed. A new, suffocating atmosphere of uncertainty settled over the company's opulent headquarters. But Richard, in his boundless arrogance, saw not a threat, but an opportunity. He saw a power vacuum. He believed his projects were too valuable, his performance too stellar, for him to be considered disposable. He saw this as his chance to impress the mysterious new ownership, to consolidate his power, and perhaps even make a play for the CEO position himself. While his colleagues updated their resumes, Richard spent his evenings perfecting a presentation, a grand summary of his achievements and future vision, ready to prove his indispensable worth to the faceless entities who now held his fate in their hands. He was meticulously preparing the case for his own prosecution, believing it to be his defense. What Richard failed to comprehend was that his job was merely one small province in the empire of his life that Amelia now controlled. A few weeks after the corporate coup, a sleek, cream-colored envelope was slipped under the door of his penthouse. It was a notice to all residents, written in a bland, corporate font. It stated that the management of the building had been transferred from Walker Luxury Properties to a new firm, Argent Management Group. Argent Management Group was, of course, a wholly owned subsidiary of one of Amelia's ghost companies. In a single transaction, she had become his landlord. The change was subtle at first. The morning newspapers were delivered 10 minutes later. The lobby flowers seemed a little less fresh. But it was a constant, low-level reminder that the world was changing around him in ways he couldn't quite grasp. He and Isabella complained to the new building manager, a stern, unsmiling woman who listened to their grievances with polite indifference and did nothing. He was a king complaining about the service in a castle that now belonged to his enemy. And then there was the debt. Amelia knew that Richard and Isabella's lavish lifestyle was their lifeblood, the public performance of their success. So she bought the performance. She had her financial team identify the boutique private bank that handled the Obsidian credit cards and personal credit lines for Walker Corp's senior executives. In another quiet, all-cash transaction, one of her investment firms acquired that bank's entire portfolio of high-risk, high-yield personal debt. So every time Isabella swiped her card for a $5,000 handbag, every time Richard charged a $20,000 weekend trip to a private resort, the transaction would appear on a detailed, itemized report that was delivered to Amelia's desk. She would review these reports not with anger, but with a cold, anthropological curiosity. She saw the receipts from restaurants she and Richard used to frequent, now 5 times as expensive. She saw the purchases from jewelers, the payments for private jet charters, the profligate, desperate spending of 2 people trying to convince the world and themselves that they were happy. It was the vulgar, ostentatious display of a life built on her ruin, and she now held the ledger. She was not just their landlord, she was their creditor. She owned the roof over their heads and the very credit that funded their illusion of happiness. Richard Sterling was living in a world where every pillar of his existence, his career, his home, his finances, was now secretly, completely, owned by the woman he had dismissed as a redundant asset. He was a fly, caught and struggling in a web he couldn't see, feeling the vibrations of his doom but never seeing the spider. With all the pieces in place, the time for subtlety was over. The time for the reveal had arrived. An email was dispatched from the office of the new interim board. It was sent to the 30 most senior executives at Walker Corporation, including Richard Sterling. The subject line was stark: Mandatory Senior Leadership Summit. The body of the email was brief and clinical. An all-hands, emergency meeting of the senior executive team will be held tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. sharp in the main boardroom on the 50th floor. The purpose of this summit is to introduce the new majority ownership representative and to outline the strategic future of Walker Corporation. Attendance is not optional. Richard read the email with a surge of adrenaline. This was it. This was his moment. He would wear his best suit. He would have his presentation loaded on his tablet. He would walk into that room and prove that he was the future of the company. As he stood in his vast walk-in closet that evening, selecting a power tie, he felt a supreme, unshakable confidence. He had no idea that he was not dressing for a promotion. He was dressing for his own execution. The boardroom of Walker Corporation was a cathedral of power. Located on the 50th floor, its glass walls offered a godlike, panoramic view of the city, a sprawling kingdom of concrete and ambition. The 30 most powerful executives in the company were assembled around a vast obsidian table that reflected their anxious faces like a dark, still lake. A nervous energy, thick with whispered rumors and fearful speculation, filled the air. They were all titans in their own right, masters of their individual domains, but today they were supplicants, waiting to meet their new, unknown god. The only person in the room who seemed immune to the tension was Richard Sterling. He strode in with the easy confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable. His custom-tailored suit, a suit of armor. His smile, a weapon. He clasped shoulders, offered firm handshakes, and took his seat near the head of the table, placing his tablet before him. On it was the presentation he believed would secure his future. He was a gladiator entering the arena for a coronation, not realizing he was the sacrifice. The interim board members filed in, their faces grim and unreadable, and took their seats. A hush fell over the room. The retired judge, a man named Coleman, stood. His voice was a low, solemn rumble that commanded immediate respect. "Good morning," he began, his eyes sweeping across the room. "We appreciate you all gathering on such short notice. Walker Corporation is entering a new era, an era of transparency, accountability, and bold strategic realignment. To that end, it is my distinct honor to introduce the architect of that new era, the representative of the majority ownership, and the new chairwoman of the board." The heavy oak doors at the far end of the boardroom swung open silently. A figure stepped through. The silhouette was of a woman, trim and poised, the sharp click of her heels on the marble floor, the only sound in the cavernous room. She was dressed in a simple, exquisitely cut navy blue suit, a stark statement of power that needed no embellishment. She walked with a calm, deliberate pace to the head of the table, her presence radiating an authority so absolute that every person in the room, including Richard, straightened in their seat. She stopped at the head of the table, and as she turned, the morning light from the vast windows illuminated her face. It was a face that was older, leaner, and infinitely stronger than he remembered, but it was a face that was seared into the very fabric of his guilt. The confident smirk on Richard's face did not just vanish, it shattered. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving a sickly, waxy pallor. His mind, once so quick and cunning, stuttered to a halt, refusing to process the impossible sight before him. He saw the woman he had left for dead, the wife he had discarded like trash, standing at the apex of his world, in the very seat of power he had coveted his entire life. A low, strangled sound caught in his throat. The tablet, containing the presentation that was to be his triumph, slipped from his suddenly nerveless fingers and clattered onto the obsidian table, the sound as loud as a gunshot in the dead silence. Amelia's eyes swept over the room, acknowledging the stunned faces, before finally, briefly, landing on Richard. Her expression was utterly neutral, like a doctor observing a specimen under a microscope. Then she addressed the room. Her voice was calm, low, and perfectly modulated, carrying a chilling lack of emotion. "Good morning," she said. My name is Amelia Sterling. And as of 48 hours ago, my holding companies acquired a controlling interest in this corporation. A collective, sharp intake of breath went around the table. The name, a ghost from Richard's past, was now the signature on their future. She didn't look at him again. Not yet. She addressed the other executives, speaking their language with a fluency that stunned them. She spoke of leveraging assets, of trimming non-performing divisions, of shareholder value. It was a masterclass in corporate strategy, delivered with icy precision. Then, after establishing her unquestionable command, her gaze moved with deliberate slowness down the table and locked onto Richard. The air grew thick, heavy, unbreathable. "Mr. Sterling," she said. The formal address, a deliberate, cold blade. "I've had the opportunity to conduct a preliminary review of all major ongoing projects. Your signature project, the Hudson Yards Spire, is of particular interest." In the next 60 seconds, she systematically, brutally, dismembered his life's work. She quoted his own inflated profit projections and then contrasted them with the grim reality of the market data. She pointed out the structural flaws in his financing model, the unsustainable debt-to-equity ratio, the very same predatory loan structures he had once used on her. She exposed his masterpiece not as a monument to his genius, but as a reckless, ego-driven gamble that was threatening to bankrupt the company. She did it all without raising her voice, using the cold, hard language of numbers to humiliate him in a way 1,000 emotional screams never could. When she was finished, the room was utterly silent. Richard sat frozen, his face a mask of abject horror. Amelia let the silence hang in the air for a moment before delivering the coup de grace. "Therefore," she stated, her voice as flat as a funeral dirge, "my first official act as chairwoman is to terminate the Hudson Yards Spire project, effective immediately, and to write it off as a total loss. My second act is to streamline this company's operations by eliminating all redundant assets." She paused, letting the two words sink into Richard's soul, the echo of that long-ago phone call with his mother, now a deafening roar in his ears. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her eyes boring into his, "your position has been deemed redundant. Your employment with Walker Corporation is terminated, effective immediately. Security will now escort you from the premises." On cue, 2 uniformed security guards stepped into the room, their faces impassive, and stood behind Richard's chair. He didn't move. He couldn't. He was paralyzed by the sheer, catastrophic scale of his ruin. Amelia had already turned her attention back to the rest of the terrified board. "Furthermore," she announced, "all executive compensation and bonus packages are suspended, pending a full and forensic audit." Just as the guards placed their hands on Richard's shoulders to lift him to his feet, a young assistant scurried into the room and handed a thick, legal-sized envelope to the head of security. The guard, in turn, placed it on the table directly in front of Richard's unseeing eyes. Amelia's voice cut through the air one last time, a final, parting shot. "That is a personal matter, Mr. Sterling," she said, without looking at him. "A delivery from your new landlord. It's a 30-day notice to vacate. It appears the new owners of your building are also realigning their assets." With that, she turned her back on him completely, a ghost exorcised, and began outlining the new reporting structure to her remaining staff. He was already ancient history. The guards hauled him to his feet, a hollowed-out man, and walked him out of the room, leaving behind only the faint, metallic scent of justice. The final confrontation, when it came, did not take place in a sterile boardroom or a soulless legal office. It happened in the heart of Amelia's new world, the flagship Amelia's Hearth Cafe. It was late in the evening. The last of the customers had gone, and Amelia was sitting at a small corner table with Mr. Chen, reviewing the day's accounts over cups of jasmine tea. The peace was shattered by the violent ringing of the bell above the door. Richard and Margaret Sterling burst in, looking like ghosts from a shipwreck. Richard was a hollowed-out version of his former self, his expensive suit rumpled, his face pale and slack with shock. But Margaret was a storm of fury, her eyes blazing with a lifetime of entitled rage, her face a contorted mask of disbelief. "You," she spat, her voice a venomous hiss, pointing a trembling finger at Amelia. You little gutter rat, you think you can steal from us? We gave you everything, and this is how you repay us? By destroying our family?" Richard stood silently behind her, a broken puppet propped up by his mother's rage. Amelia didn't flinch. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her tea, her calmness a stark contrast to Margaret's hysteria. "I didn't steal anything from you, Margaret," Amelia said, her voice quiet and even. "I simply took back what you and your son stole from me. As for destroying your family, you did that yourselves long before I came along." This calm denial, this refusal to engage in her drama, seemed to enrage Margaret even more. "You were nothing," she shrieked, taking a step forward. "A charity case. Richard picked you out of obscurity, and you poisoned him. You turned him into this failure." It was then that Mr. Chen placed his teacup down with a quiet, definitive click. He stood up slowly, his small frame exuding an immense, ancient gravity. He looked at Margaret, his eyes holding a sorrow that was decades old. "He was a failure long before he met Amelia," Mr. Chen said, his voice soft but carrying an undeniable authority. "He failed the moment he chose to continue his family's legacy of lies." Margaret stared at him, her rage momentarily replaced by confusion. "And who are you to speak of my family?" she demanded. Mr. Chen gave a sad, faint smile. "You don't remember me, of course. I was just a boy. But I am sure you remember my father's name, Chen Daiyu." He then turned to Margaret and used a name she hadn't heard in public for 50 years. "And you, Margaret Devereux, I am sure you remember your own father, Edward Devereux." The name hit Margaret like a physical blow. The color, which had been high with rage, drained completely from her face. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Richard looked back and forth between his mother and Mr. Chen, a dawning horror on his face. "My father," Mr. Chen continued, his voice now a quiet narrative of pain, "was Edward Devereux's partner and his friend. He trusted your father with everything: his money, his reputation, his future. But your father was a thief. He ran one of the largest Ponzi schemes of his generation, robbing dozens of families, including his own partners, of their fortunes. And when it was all about to collapse, he didn't face the consequences. He transferred the stolen millions to a secret Swiss account, faked his own death in a boating accident, and disappeared, leaving men like my father to face the ruin, the shame, and the federal investigators. He let the story hang in the air of the quiet, fragrant cafe. My father lost everything, Mr. Chen said, his voice thick with memory. Our home, our savings, our good name. The shame killed him. He died a broken man, and my family was cast into poverty, forced to flee to a new country and start again with nothing but the clothes on our backs. Your old money, Margaret, the wealth you have lorded over everyone your entire life, is not old money. It is blood money. It is stolen money. It is my father's money." The final truth landed, and the entire rotten edifice of Margaret Sterling's life crumbled to dust. Richard stared at his mother, who was now trembling, her face a mask of utter devastation. He finally understood. He understood the constant pressure, the desperate need to acquire more, to build higher, to be seen as legitimate. His entire life's ambition had not been about building an empire. It had been about outrunning a ghost. Their frantic accumulation of wealth was a desperate attempt to generate enough clean money to hide the dirty secret at the foundation of their family, to pay the blackmailers and the keepers of secrets who would occasionally surface. Amelia looked at Mr. Chen, her ally, her friend, and now the final piece of her own story. He had told her everything a week ago, just before the final move on Walker Corporation, cementing their pact not just in business, but in a shared, profound justice. "When I saw what your son did to Amelia," Mr. Chen said, his gaze returning to Margaret, "I saw the same sickness, the same Devereux pattern of using people, of bleeding them dry and discarding the husk. I had been watching your family for years, waiting. And in Amelia, I found not a victim, but a champion. I helped her, yes, but her will, her intelligence, her spirit, that was all her own. She was not the instrument of my revenge. She was an instrument of a justice that has been waiting for half a century to be served." Amelia's takeover had not just been a corporate maneuver, it was a forensic audit of a family's soul. In acquiring Walker Corp., her teams had uncovered the labyrinth of trusts and offshore accounts that led back to Edward Devereaux's original stolen fortune. She had, without even knowing it at first, found the proof that would clear Mr. Chen's father's name and expose the Sterling family's foundational crime. The ruin was now absolute, generational, and perfectly, poetically, just. Margaret made no more sounds. The fight was gone, replaced by the hollow emptiness of a life built on a lie that had finally been called due. Richard, for his part, looked at Amelia, and for the first time, she saw not arrogance or hatred, but a flicker of comprehension. He finally understood that he was not the author of this story, but merely the final, pathetic chapter in a much older, sadder book. Mr. Chen simply nodded towards the door. There was nothing left to say. Margaret, now a frail, old woman, allowed herself to be led out by her broken son. They disappeared into the night, not as vanquished titans, but as the tired, exposed ghosts they truly were. The circle was closed. The debt, a debt that spanned 2 families and 2 generations, had finally been paid in full. Justice is not always a thunderous verdict delivered in a court of law. Sometimes it is a quiet, slow-growing thing, like a mighty oak rising from a poisoned seed. It takes years of silence, of darkness, of unseen growth before its true, unshakable form is revealed. Several years after the fall of the House of Sterling, on a bitterly cold Christmas Eve, the flagship Amelia's Hearth Cafe was closed to the public, but its doors were wide open. Inside, it was a haven of light and warmth, the air thick with the scent of roasted turkey, spiced gingerbread, and humanity. This was Amelia's annual tradition, a free, gourmet dinner for the city's homeless and hungry. She had become a celebrated philanthropist, a titan of industry with a baker's heart. But on this night, she was not a CEO. She wore a simple apron over a cashmere sweater, and she was on the serving line, ladling gravy, her face filled with a serene, hard-won peace. She moved with a quiet grace, offering a warm smile to each person who came before her. She saw not a nameless crowd, but individuals, each with a story etched into the lines of their face. She saw their weariness, their loneliness, and for a few hours, she offered them dignity, warmth, and a meal made with love. The line shuffled forward, a slow procession of the city's forgotten souls. And then, a man stepped forward, his head bowed, a threadbare scarf pulled high to hide his face. He was hunched, his body curved into a question mark of defeat, trying to make himself as small as possible. He held out his plate, his eyes fixed on the floor. "Gravy?" Amelia asked softly, the same question she had asked 100 times that night. The man had to look up, and as he did, the scarf slipped slightly. His eyes, hollowed out by years of hardship and haunted by 1,000 private ghosts, met hers. The ladle in Amelia's hand froze for a fraction of a second. The face was gaunt, the skin sallow and etched with the fine lines of malnutrition and despair. The hair, once a proud, thick mane, was now thin, dull, and shot through with a brittle gray. The charisma, the arrogance, the entire edifice of the man he once was had been stripped away, leaving behind only the raw, pathetic truth. It was Richard. A universe of unspoken history passed between them in that silent, 5-second eternity. In his eyes, she saw it all. The shock, the recognition, and then a wave of shame so profound, so agonizing, it was as if his very soul were collapsing. He flinched, almost dropping his plate, his gaze darting away as if the sight of her was a physical blow. He was confronted by the full, crushing weight of his life's choices, embodied in the woman he had tried to erase. She was the queen of this warm, bright kingdom of her own making, and he was a beggar at her feast. And in her eyes, he saw the one thing he was not prepared for. He saw no hatred. He saw no triumph. He saw no satisfaction. He saw only a vast, calm, and distant pity. The rage he had inspired in her had long ago burned itself out, and what was left was not love or hate, but a profound and final indifference. The young volunteer, serving mashed potatoes next to her, sensing the sudden tension, hesitated, his scoop hovering. Amelia broke her gaze from Richard and gave the young man a small, almost imperceptible nod, gesturing with her eyes toward Richard's plate. The volunteer understood. He added a second, generous scoop of potatoes. Amelia followed by ladling an extra portion of rich, dark gravy over his turkey. It was a simple, anonymous gesture of grace, the kind she had offered to every other hungry person that night. Richard stood frozen for a moment longer, his throat working but no words coming out. He gave a jerky, broken nod of thanks, took his plate, and quickly shuffled away, finding the darkest, most remote corner of the room to sit in, his back turned to the warmth and light of the world she now commanded. Amelia watched him go, her expression unchanged. She then turned to the next person in line, an elderly woman with a kind smile, and offered her a warm piece of bread. The ghost had appeared, and her world had not even trembled. Her life, her peace, her purpose, it all continued, completely uninterrupted by his pathetic presence. And in that moment, the true nature of her victory was made clear. The real revenge was never the corporate takedown. It was not the firing, nor the eviction. Those were merely the consequences, the falling of dominoes. The real, enduring, and total victory was this. It was the building of Amelia's hearth. It was the creation of a life so full of purpose, so rich with meaning, that his memory no longer had the power to cast a shadow. She had won not by destroying him, but by rebuilding herself into something so magnificent that he simply ceased to matter. Never underestimate the silence of a person who has endured too much. Because when they finally decide to act, they don't create a storm. They become the storm, a quiet one that can reshape the entire landscape. Thank you for joining us for this story of justice and rebirth. The best victories are not those won over our enemies, but those won over ourselves. Join us again next week as we explore a family's deadly secret, hidden within the pages of a contested will, where the deepest betrayals are spoken in whispers of love. Until then, sleep well.